I'm pleased to welcome Richard and Rutger.
Thanks.
Well.
Good to see you, Richard.
Very good to see you. I just want to start by saying I'm very disappointed in your beard. I'd seen pictures of you, and I thought possibly you might have let it go in lockdown.
I know.
You might be doing the full Viking.
I know. There's this one picture of me actually that they've been using for years, and it's like the kind of picture that, you know, theoretically I can look like that, but I almost never really actually do look like that. So often when I meet readers, you know, for events, I can sort of see the disappointment in their eyes. So it's this picture. So can you see it, right? This?
Oh,
so,
Christ, yes.
I mean, anyone can see that I don't really look like that. But anyway, I can understand your disappointment.
Well, look, oh, by the way, I was just, there was a sort of double meaning in that introduction. Are you the best-selling ever Dutch historian? Because it said best-selling Dutch historian. Now, I know you're best-selling and you're Dutch and you're a historian. Are there other historians from Holland who've done better?
Well, certainly better in the Netherlands. So we've got, for example, Geert Mak, maybe you know him. He's written this wonderful book about Europe and the history of Europe. I'm not sure how well that did in the UK and the US, but right. Yeah, I can't complain.
So you're a best-selling Dutch historian. So it's very good to see you. I hope there's someone else out there, but if it's just us, then that's a pleasure too. And I've got a copy of the book as well, and I just wanted to start by praising it. It's a very good book. And I once went away for 6 months and bought actually some of the books you mentioned in your book. Mm-hmm. And my experience of sort of intellectual books is they all have a chapter 1 where they say, I'm going to write a book that everyone can understand. And lastly, I'm going to open this out for the general public. Mm-hmm. And then chapter 2, you can't understand a word. They think they're talking people's language, but actually there are so many words you don't understand. But this is an immensely exciting and interesting book, but also, comprehensible to the lay reader. I wanted to congratulate you for that. I mean, did you have that in your mind a lot? You thinking, I want everyone to be able to understand it?
Yes, absolutely. There's this saying from Jos de Blok, one of the characters in the second half of the book, the guy who founded this healthcare organization that is totally, built on trust. They have these self-directed teams and, he's ditched all the management. And he said to me at one point that it's quite easy to make things more complicated. I mean, that's basically what the whole knowledge economy is about. A whole class of people who are being educated to make things more complicated than they really have to be. All the consultants and the lawyers and the bureaucrats. But it's quite difficult to make something a bit more simple to understand. I mean, this is always, when you really understand something, then I think you should be able to explain it to your grandma.
Well, you really let yourself in for it. 'Cause my first question was, because we're going to wind around. Tell us about the book in 2 minutes. Tell us your basic thesis, so that everyone knows what the bits and what the roads I go down are linked to.
Well, I could also do it in 10 seconds or 5, which would be something like, most people deep down are pretty decent. That is the thesis that I'm trying to defend here. And I'm very much arguing against the idea that people deep down are just selfish. This is what scientists call veneer theory. The notion that our civilization, everything that makes us good and lets us behave is only a thin layer. And that just below the surface, there is a savage or a Nazi or a monster in each and every one of us. And I think that's wrong.
Red in tooth and claw, or whatever that is.
Yes. And there are many different versions of this veneer theory. You find it in economics. There's a version which is called the Homo economicus view of human nature, or you find it in, some evolutionary theories, as you mentioned, or you find it in anthropology or archaeology or social psychology, the famous experiments, the Stanford prison experiment, the Milgram experiment. So I just look at a lot of different versions of this veneer theory. Also in literature, by the way, Lord of the Flies is, I think, one of the most famous examples. And I try to show case after case that veneer theory really is wrong, and that, no, we're not deep down all selfish.
Yeah, well, that is, look, and you could have even said it in 2 words, which is humankind, because, and it's a very witty title.
Yeah, my wife thought of it. So credit goes to her.
And by the way, and my instincts are the same. I, run a charity, just found almost everyone we approach good, willing to put themselves out on other people's behalf, enormous public generosity and everything like that. I am interested in whether or not, you've done it in line with your life or despite it. I mean, one of the reasons I write such happy things is I think a person who's had such a lucky life, if I were then to say, yeah, I've had a good life, but let me write about serial killers, that would be unrepresentative. As it were, is that your instinct? Is that who you are? Is that what, has life made you happy? Or is this a theory developed against epic struggles?
Well, two things. So in the first place, no, it's not a theory developed against epic struggles. I'm a highly privileged person who's grown up in a pretty wonderful country and wonderful parents, wonderful sisters. So, I mean, I completely get it when people say, oh, well, that's easy for you to write a book like that. You have not suffered from abuse as a child or, and so many things that can be horrible in people's lives. I have not suffered from that. But then it's also true that I used to have a much more cynical view of human nature. So, and this was actually one of the reasons why I wrote this book. My previous book, Utopia for Realists, argued for some ideas that may seem radical now, but actually may be realistic in the future. Like, for example, eradicating poverty by just giving everyone money. And I noticed that many people were skeptical of that idea of universal basic income because they said, well, people are just selfish, they're just lazy, it's not going to work. And then I did point at the scientific evidence and said, well, but this experiment, it actually does work. But again and again, I found myself discussing human nature with people. They wanted to have this deeper philosophical discussion. And then I realized that maybe because I'd studied history, or maybe because I'm just, I don't know, a product of Western society as well, that actually my own view of human nature was disconnected from my belief in some of these ideas. Because I had read about the Stanford prison experiment. I had read about history. I remember, as a young history student, reading everything I could about, the Second World War and the Holocaust, and thinking again and again, oh, human beings are just monsters. That's the only way we can explain this. So in many ways, writing this book has been a reckoning with my own ideas that I used to have.
That's very interesting. I mean, it's a very powerful idea, the one that you're talking about. But one of the things that intrigues me about the book is it's also about the power of ideas. And one of the things you are doing is debunking some ideas and theories that have taken hold, as it were, almost against the evidence. And there's a great series of things on that. I mean, as you mentioned, the Stanford prison experiment, and you mentioned the murder of Kitty Genovese. Is there an example you'd like to give of an idea that's been very powerful and was actually wrong? Because I think those are some of the juiciest bits.
Well, I think you and I are both interested in the power of stories. Because we human beings, we tend to become the stories that we tell ourselves. And for a very long time in literature, in history, and in science, we've been telling ourselves quite cynical stories. And my critique here is that these can become self-fulfilling prophecies.
Yeah.
If we believe that people are just selfish deep down, then we may design our societies around that idea and build schools based on such a view. The classic British boarding school is, I think, based on the idea that people are just selfish. Same is true for our workplaces and our democracies and even our prisons. So if we turn it around, if we actually start telling different stories about who we are, then, maybe we can move into a different direction. And obviously one of my favorite, at least one of my favorite chapters in the book is about one of the most famous novels of the 20th century, which is Lord of the Flies. Now, obviously that's not a scientific experiment, but somehow, it's been so hugely influential. Millions of kids around the globe, especially in the US and the UK, were basically forced to read it. And I remember reading it when I was 16 or 17 years old and having this sort of depressed feeling. Oh, well, maybe this is actually true. Yeah. So I had a lot of fun looking at that story.
And finding a real story that did not confirm William Golding's bias.
Exactly. Yeah. So in 1965, near Tonga, an island group in the Pacific Ocean, there was actually a real life Lord of the Flies case where 6 kids shipwrecked on an island after they had drifted for 8 days on the ocean. You know, they were also students of a boarding school, but they didn't like the school. They thought it was boring, so they went on an adventure. Then ended up on this island and managed to survive for 15 months. And how did they survive? Well, by working together and by staying friends. So sometimes they did end up in fights, but then one of them would go to one side of the island and the other would go to the other side of the island, and they would cool off a little bit, come back and say sorry. And I just thought it was, I mean, for me, it was really one of the highlights of my career so far, to be honest, to be able to track them down.
Had actually existed. I mean, it's such a, I love the, you know, it's great that you picked on Lord of the Flies, which is a book that most of us have read, that you didn't say, well, Crime and Punishment isn't true, because then everyone who read it think, oh God, I better read Crime and Punishment. Well, most of us have read Lord of the Flies. I mean, it's quite a fun book. I was just saying to you, I like the bit where it says that we should snuggle, not struggle, that the success of humankind may have been our capacity for being nice to each other rather than fighting against each other. One of the kind of core things that come up, again, a lovely phrase, is homo puppy. Which doesn't sound like a serious scientific theory, but a lot of the book does look back, as it were, at the formation of civilization. Do you want to just say a bit about that? Because that's one of the ideas that's certainly struck me clearest. How we turned out to be the winning race.
This is one of the really interesting questions about our history, obviously. Why did we conquer the globe? Why not the Neanderthals or some of the other hominid species who were still around 50,000 years ago? What makes us so special? And for a long time, people believe that, you know, we were chosen by God. Well, many people don't believe that anymore. Specifically, scientists don't believe it. Well, then maybe it's because we're so smart. Maybe because we have these huge brains that use around 20% of our energy. But then, you know, you can look at intelligence tests where human toddlers of around 2 years old compete with bonobos or chimpanzees or pigs, and then often the animals win. You know, especially
we're very ill-equipped when we come out of the womb.
And pigs are really smart. So individually, it's not clear that we're really all that smart. Then are we very powerful or strong? No, neither. I mean, you don't want to do a boxing match with a chimpanzee. You'd probably lose. So the theory that scientists have now come up with is that what makes us special is our ability to cooperate. And you can only cooperate if you actually, you know, like each other a little bit. This is what they call survival of the friendliest, which means that for millennia, I was the friendliest among us who had the most kids and still had the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation. And astonishingly, this is really what you see in our evolutionary history. You know, if you compare skeletons from 50, 40, 30, 20, 10,000 years ago, you see the puppification of humanity. You look at our skulls and the scientific term is we've domesticated ourselves. Self-domestication is the theory. So what the dog is to the wolf, we are to our ancestors or to the Neanderthals. We've sort of tamed ourselves. And I thought that was really fascinating because in the same sort of period of time, actually our brains got smaller. We sort of became weaker. And this turns out that this is actually the secret of our success because it enabled us to cooperate on a scale that no other species in the whole animal kingdom can.
Well, look, I'm actually going to maybe ask you about the Sustainable Development Goals, for which I'm an advocate at some point, which is, as it were, my favorite plan for humanity. But in that thing, the 17th goal is partnership, that actually none of this is going to work unless we work together. And if we work together, then suddenly everything may work. Going back to, you know, because you do debunk quite a few famous experiments and famous theories, like the Stanford prison one, which you said was entirely rigged and was almost like a sort of drama that was set out by two people rather than a real thing where it turned out that guards were bad and good and all of that kind of thing. Are you going to get debunked? Are you braced now? Are you waiting for someone? Is someone going to come and say, no, this is wrong, he's got his science wrong? Is a book going to come out called Human Nasty? Is Richard Dawkins going to come around? I think you described The Selfish Gene as that depressing book at one point. in your community? Can you feel it coming at you?
Hmm.
Are you sure you're completely right?
Obviously not, and otherwise I would be a fraud. And I've actually already had, emails from readers who pointed, so far relatively small mistakes out to me, and that'll hopefully be corrected in the next edition. But what I try to do with this book is to write something that people can still read 10 years from now. And, that's actually a really, really hard task to set for yourself, because obviously you have at some point, or I had at some point, an idea, where I wanted to talk about the decency of people. And then you have new papers coming in, for example, from Nature or Science, the world's most respected scientific journals, that seem to fit your theory. And then it's very attractive, or, you're really being seduced to use those papers. But then you think, hey, wait a minute, replication crisis. There's this whole movement or phenomenon in science where they found out that so much scientific theories or ideas don't actually hold up. So that 4 or 5 years later, actually, we don't believe in some things anymore. So what I try to do in this book is to rely on what scientists call meta-analyses, where they just bring together a huge amount of studies, like 50 or 100, and then look at the average effect of a particular procedure or something like that.
I mean, that's one of the things we haven't had time for, isn't it, by the way? Because one of the most famous phrases at the moment is follow the science. And it turns out that scientists don't agree. And
exactly. And that's the point of science.
Yeah.
That's the point. It just takes a lot of time. Yeah. So obviously we can't expect of scientists to very quickly agree. And this is the problem with a lot of science journalism as well. You see this in the newspaper, like new theory proves this or new study proves that. Well, that's not how science actually works. It's a very slow and gradual process.
I hope at least 75% of your book is true.
Well, that would be, I would be happy with that.
I'm very interested in kind of, you say read it in 10 years time. And I really want to talk to you a bit later about what we can do, about efficacy, about, using theory. But of course, this is a very interesting moment now. I just wanted your take now, because you're releasing this during the COVID crisis. And a lot of people would say that we've had a failure of leadership in some places, and that we've had contradictions of science, but that what they have taken away is an enormous amount about human kindness and the way that people operate in communities and are willing to change their behaviors. I mean, as you've been going through the crisis, has the way it bounces around with your book, have you got theories about the crisis based on your book, as it were?
Yes. So a big part of my book is actually about how people respond to crisis. And if we go back to the veneer theory, then you'd say, well, during a moment of crisis, when there's a natural disaster or a pandemic like we're in right now, then people will just start looting and plundering and hoarding as much as possible for themselves. And sure, I mean, we can count on the news media to focus on those examples. But I think that if we zoom out just a little bit, then we'll see that actually we've seen an explosion of altruism from the beginning of this crisis. And this is also what we know from sociology. Sociologists have, since the 1960s, studied what happens after natural disasters. And well, what's in the news all the time is all the stories about plundering and looting and violence. I mean, we can all remember 2005, Katrina, when New Orleans was flooded. But then the sociologists do the actual research and they discover that what really happens is an explosion of altruism. People working together.
And that has been extraordinary. I mean, it is a great moment in a way for the book to come out. And I've been, there are great bits in your book. You have some statistic about the fact that most soldiers in war don't kill other soldiers.
Yeah.
That even in that context, human instinct is to try and pull away, and that actually to increase the murderousness of war, what people have had to do is introduce distance between the perpetrator and the victims.
Yeah. And it's a very dark truth about our species that we are capable of that. So I don't want to downplay that. I've tried to write or come up with a quite paradoxical view of human nature. On the one hand, we're one of the friendliest species in the animal kingdom, and this is the secret of our success. But we also do, the most horrible things in the name of friendliness or in the name of loyalty and comradeship. And indeed, maybe violence is not, it doesn't give us great psychological satisfaction most of the time. I mean, we love sex, we love food, but violence often traumatizes us, and soldiers come back with PTSD, but then we're still capable of it under certain circumstances. And we do things that no other species in the animal kingdom does, like ethnic cleansing, genocide, wars. So, I really don't want to downplay any of that.
No, and I think it's important to say about the book that if you, as it were, make the argument for kindness, cooperation, all those instinctive things, I'm so uninterested in the idea of black and white. It's either this or it's that. There are things you can't put aside. There are emotions in yourself that you recognize. But it's good to give a voice, I think, to those people who actually think there are real reasons for optimism, both historical and in our makeup. Can we just talk for a second, since we're there, a bit about Black Lives Matter, which is the other thing that's in the ethos at the moment? Obviously, in America, based at the start on the slave trade, and here, one of the great human evils where people just didn't notice how horrifically they were behaving, or did notice and didn't care. What's your feeling about, as it were, the book and that? If you said there are actions we can or should take to address this huge social issue, are there lessons you think we could learn? There's a whole chapter about race and policing, isn't there?
Yes.
But
yes.
Are there, if you were saying we could or should do something that would be effective soon, you got any thoughts about this particular moment in history?
Yes. So I think what we can see very clearly now is that those at the top, they want us to believe in this cynical view of human nature and this veneer theory. They want us to watch as much CNN and Fox News as possible, so that we'll be afraid, we'll be scared, and it's just easier to rule people who are scared. That's what they're saying when they're calling for law and order. It's another way of saying, don't trust your neighbors. They could be savages. They can very quickly start looting your shop or your store or your home, and that's why we need to bring in the police and bring in the army, send in the troops, etc. All those ideas and views are based on this more cynical view of who we are, and that's why I think it's so important to again zoom out and emphasize that it's just incredible to see that in 50 states in the US and around the globe, millions and millions of protesters are very courageously and against the odds protesting peacefully. And again, that gives me great hope, because we also have evidence from sociology. Again, there's one sociologist, Erica Chenoweth, who's built this huge database where she looked at resistance movements, protest movement, and found that actually peaceful protest movements are twice as successful as violent movements. Now, that's not for me to say that, that I want to say, oh, we should don't loot or anything like that. I will never advocate violence, but I think it's we should first look at the people who are causing all this behavior and look at 400 years of racism and slavery, etc., and or oppression. But it does give me great hope to see this whole movement, and I think it's a defining moment.
Let's hope so. Let's hope practical action follows, and not just an extremely long report and everything stays the same. As I said, I'm a very lucky person, tried to use some of the advantages I've had to, fundraise and campaign and all those things. It was interesting. I think the first time I heard your name was when you went to Davos and just said to everybody, pay more tax. But when you are developing these theories and looking back at how society operates, are you honing in on any political actions and priorities yourself? If you were trying to start 3 new narratives, what would those be? If someone's watching this and saying, I think he's instinctively right, I do think human beings mean well, in which case, why are so many things going wrong? What do you think are the social low-hanging fruits that you'd be, if you stopped being a writer now and became a politician, what would you fight for first?
I think it's all about building different kind of institutions. So I didn't want to write a self-help book, even though I couldn't resist writing one epilogue with a couple of rules for life, if you really believe in this.
I like those. Don't punch a Nazi was one of the ways.
Yeah, but I mean, people are shaped by the institutions in which they live, the schools, the way our democracies are organized, the workplaces where we work. And I just wanted to give people a couple of examples, a couple of case studies of visionaries who are already implementing this new view of human nature that scientists have come up with in the last 15 to 20 years. Because it may sound quite innocent. Oh, this guy's written this book about kindness and about how people are friendly, but it's actually quite subversive. It means we can organize our society in a radically different way, much more egalitarian, more genuinely democratic. So indeed, we already talked about the healthcare organization with Jos de Blok, the one who said that it's relatively easy to make things complicated. Well, he's built this organization that's completely based on trust, self-directed teams of 12, 13 nurses, 15,000 employers, actually delivers higher quality healthcare at a cheaper cost with higher salaries for the employees. It's a fantastic model. It's now expanding around the globe. I think it's just one of those examples of what you can actually start to do once you update your view of who we are as a species.
Yeah, so that's interesting, because actually now I'm thinking about it, the book does a lot of people are talking about doing things locally and working in your own community. And I've just written here, so you do deal with businesses, schools, prisons, with those things that actually all of us are involved in. So your sense might be, rather than necessarily the high politics of it, if we could get the functional pieces to work, it would make a lot of difference.
Yeah, and I think that everyone can sort of do something with this view of human nature in his or her own life or his or her own workplace or institution. I'm actually curious how you look at this, because I wondered why this Lord of the Flies story, the real Lord of the Flies story, why it never became famous. And there's obviously the fact that these were not white kids. So maybe that's one of the reasons why Hollywood didn't take it up, even though now there's actually a big Hollywood deal. So New Regency,
oh, good. All right.
Makers of 12 Years a Slave and The Revenant is going to make a movie about it. But this is something that you see quite a lot, is that it just seems to be easier to make stories or films or novels about people being nasty to each other, because then there's tension, right? I mean, we talked about the Stanford prison experiment, and well, the standard story is that Philip Zimbardo, the psychologist, the researcher, had these students, 24 in total. He made 12 of them into guards, 12 of them into prisoners. This was the beginning of the 70s. And supposedly these prisoners turn into sadist monsters after just a couple of days, just because they were given a uniform and were given this power. We now know that this, I mean, it's a complete hoax. They were specifically instructed, these students, to behave as nasty and sadistic as possible. They said they didn't want to do it, but then Zimbardo said, well, you got to do it because I need these results. So then we can go to the press and say, well, we need to reform the whole prison system. But this is a long story, but I'm getting there. What was interesting is that the BBC 20 years ago, sort of at the beginning of the era of reality television, they wanted to make a show again about this prison experiment because they thought it would be, great for television and would get wonderful ratings. Again, they had a group of guards and prisoners, but they worked with two psychologists who said, well, we can do this, but only if we won't interfere. So we're not going to instruct these guards what to do. And at the beginning of it, the British press was, full of speculation. I don't know, The Guardian and other papers were writing like, oh, this is going to be terrible and it's so unethical. Why are they doing this? But then, the show started and it turns out it's the most boring thing ever. I had to watch these 4 episodes for my book and for my readers. I'll never get those hours back. It's so boring. The first episode, the guard says, can we just be friends? The last episode, they've created this pacifistic commune together. I think that's one of the issues. It's just boring to look at people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's in the very nature of stories to have a crisis therein. I was just, I was at some meeting and they were saying about what are the best books about marriage. And it suddenly occurred to me that the best things on TV about marriage is in fact sitcoms where the people have to stay together. And you really get the texture of how a marriage works as things go in and out. But at the moment you get to a book or the moment you get to a drama series, the marriage has to break up. Otherwise, it's too dull. They've either got to get divorced or kill each other, or a tragedy has to happen. So that is in the very nature of in the very nature of drama. But I mean, I would say that a lot of soap operas and a lot of romantic things, I mean, a lot of things where people are optimistic about human nature do thrive. I suppose my own personal advice is don't write the nasty stuff if you don't feel it. Please give the good stuff. Give the good stuff a crack. Let's talk though about the news, because you are interested and worried about the news. Mm-hmm. You know, I used to be obsessed by malaria. I was writing a film about it, and there was there was both amazing sorrow and amazing good news about malaria, and because they weren't dramatic and particularly newsworthy, they didn't get into the news in the same in the same way, because people like conflict, and it's the deaths by malaria were banal. I remember working out one day that fewer people had died in 40 years of the conflict with Israel, as it were, in the Middle East, than were dying of malaria every single day. And yet the Middle East dominated every single bit of American politics and every single newspaper every day. And you read of malaria about once a year. But what's your instinct about either what we can do about the news? I think your advice at the end is don't watch the news.
Yeah.
But what's your instinct? Is there, because I think, for instance, the internet, even though there's lots about it that's bad, it's also giving a lot of voice to people who are offering help, people who do have new advice, for my daughter absolutely swears by it, that it's a refuge for people who have problems and difficulties and complexities. Have you got a feeling, what we should do about the news? Is there anything we can do about the news? What do you think?
I think we should first make a distinction between the news on the one hand and journalism. So journalism is incredibly important, and people need to subscribe to a newspaper, preferably a local one, because, I mean, good journalists help to control and keep those in power in check, speak truth to power, and report on things that are really important and focus on the structural forces that govern our lives. But the news is problematic. And sadly, too many journalists or focus too much time on the news. What happens today? I think that Elon Musk recently said this, and I quite like that, is that he said for many journalists, the most important question that they ask themselves every day, which is what is the worst thing that has happened today? We need to know it. And this has real effects. People worry a lot about the kind of food they put in their body, but we should also think about the effect of the kind of information we put in our heads. Psychologists have long known that watching too much news can cause what they call mean world syndrome, where you just become a bit more anxious and a bit more cynical because you've only been hearing about the exceptions, right? Yeah. You just breaking news this, breaking news that, and it's mostly about things that go wrong and people are behaving in a nasty way. But as I said, you should be careful here, because that doesn't mean that you shouldn't subscribe to a newspaper. That also doesn't mean that you should only look at websites, with positive news like, oh, another baby zebra has been born in this zoo or whatever. Now that's stupid. There's a lot of structural things going on that are very worrying. I mean, climate change, for example, is not like a very uplifting, and happy clappy story, but yeah, it needs to be on the front page every day.
Yeah, no, I think, and people are looking more at everything they do traditionally, what they eat, what they wear, how they travel, and maybe that kind of thoughtfulness about what the news we're consuming is and what its purpose is will be useful. Now, I just want a lot of the news features leaders, and you say some interesting things about leaders in your sense of how they developed, as it were, their power, that they weren't leaders of the same nature 30,000 years ago. And you do, quote that, power corrupts. And I sometimes wonder, is it corrupt people who become leaders, or is it the power that corrupts in the first place? Do you want to say something about our leaders and whether or not, one, there's anything we can do as citizens to try and counterbalance, spot them out, make better decisions?
If we go far back in history and look at the societies of nomadic hunter-gatherers, it's obviously hard to know how we lived 20 or 30,000 years ago, but we've got some really interesting evidence from anthropology. you know, scientists who studied tribes who still lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers in the 90s or the 20th century. And they found some striking similarities. For example, these societies are quite egalitarian. Also, equality between the sexes is important. They're almost proto-feminist. And then if you look at the leaders in these kind of societies, it's very important for them that they stay humble. Humbleness is really prerequisite if you want to survive. Maybe that's because, you know, if you live in a tough environment in the Ice Age, then you don't survive with a lot of possessions because, I mean, you can't carry them with you, but you do survive with having a lot of friends. People tend to dislike narcissists and egomaniacs. So imagine Trump in prehistory. Well, he probably wouldn't have survived for long. People wouldn't have liked him. He would have been banned from the group, and then he would have died alone. So this was the era of survival of the friendliest. But now it often seems that we are living in a very different kind of world, where it's often survival of the shameless. And it's people who don't really blush anymore who are actually ruling us. And that is quite depressing, because blushing is actually a very unique human ability. There's one study that some parrots also can do it, but apart from that, you know, we're really alone in the whole animal kingdom with this ability to blush, that we involuntarily give away our feelings to someone else. And then, I mean, I would just love to do an interview with Boris Johnson or Dominic Cummings or Donald Trump. And my first question would be, when was the last time you blushed? And I think they wouldn't have an answer there. And that is very worrying about our
When was the last time you were flushed? Then they're all going to be cracking on that. They're all very red-cheeked, but not proud.
Yeah, exactly.
Shame.
Yeah.
But it is. I mean, let me just talk about one of the questions that we've got. In fact, a few questions that said, "Well, what do I do?" I'm really interested in this. I feel as though, you know, when I started thinking about trying to do the right thing, my first charge towards charity, you know, give some money to the people who know what to do and are saving lives. And then, you know, I worked on Live 8 and Make Poverty History, and the feeling was push the politicians. They're the ones who have the big money, make sure they do the right thing with it. By the way, I still believe in charity. I still believe in pushing the politicians. But I do think there's a generational move. I noticed it a lot in my kids towards actually doing things in your own life.
Yeah.
So in other words, it is how you travel, what you wear, you know, sustainable food. I'm very interested in moral money, basically, and the idea that we should move all our pensions out of default pensions and into ethical pensions so that our money isn't contradicting, you know, our ideals. If someone said to you, and you do an instruction pamphlet, but after this, what should I change in my own behavior that lets the kind side of me be most efficacious?
You know, my father is a Protestant minister, and I mean, I'm not a Christian myself, but obviously I've been very much shaped by my parents and by Christian theology. And what I found myself doing again and again while I was finishing the book is coming back to some messages from the New Testament. So there's one part of, I think, the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, well, I'm paraphrasing here. Well, so you like your friends and you like your family, but is that really so special? I mean, we all do that. Right. What's really difficult is to love your enemies and to be nice to people who are not nice to you. I mean, that is the challenge. So there's a real difference between our capacity for friendliness, which is, I think, quite natural. I mean, we've evolved to be friendly and to work together, but being an actual good person, that is difficult. That is hard. And I think the challenge here is to really push yourself to go a little bit further and also to do things that seem counterintuitive. So often, real progress comes from people who go against the status quo, who are nasty, who are difficult, who are unfriendly, who are willing to be shamed and ridiculed for the visions they have. Look at the position of vegans. It's getting a little bit better, but it's so easy to make fun of vegans. Even though, I mean, philosophically, ethically, I mean, they've got history on their side. It wouldn't surprise me if historians will look back on this. You know,
I think the change in attitudes toward vegans is an extraordinary thing, actually.
Yeah.
In the last 5 years, how they're not much use to comedians they're not much use. I mean, that's an idea, to actually think whether or not you are doing the right thing in every context, context of your life.
And it should be a bit uncomfortable. I guess that's what, if you have the feeling, oh, I'm just leading this comfortable life, I'm giving a little bit of money to charity, and I'm just enjoying myself and having a good time with my friends and family. Well, then, yes, you are sort of doing what's in human nature. So yes, I mean, you've evolved to do that, to live in a relatively relaxed way, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're a good person, and you're certainly not a hero if you do that.
I mean, it's sort of proactive kindness. There's a thing I just watched of this singer, Leonie Lewis, saying that she was she was in a shop, and the person told her and her dad, because they were only black people in the shop, to stop touching the merchandise. Mm-hmm. And she said that everybody left the shop because they were embarrassed by it, but nobody came up and complained and supported her.
Yeah.
So being slightly more proactive in the way that we behave. I'm going to go to other people's questions now. You may have heard an alarm going off. That was me getting near saying 45 minutes. Can I just ask you, as it were, a private question? Do you have any theory about the Sustainable Development Goals? Because I'm an advocate for them, for the UN. And they're a very interesting example of what I would call humankind, in that actually every country in the world got together, agreed this immensely ambitious package for change in terms of justice and poverty and climate. You wouldn't have, countries that can't agree even on, the tiniest terms of trade, came up with this idealistic thing. Do you think that there's any place in the structure of progress for a huge plan like that?
Well, I totally agree with you that it's quite amazing. I mean, it's easy to ridicule something like that, like, oh, the United Nations comes up with some PR scheme or whatever. I mean, it's easy to set these goals and that.
193 agreed. It wasn't the United Nations saying this would be great. They fought like cats and dogs, but they did come up with a very idealistic.
And which is highly unusual. Well, it's absolutely unique in the history of the world. Same with our response to the coronavirus. I mean, we've never dealt with a pandemic in this way. In just a couple of weeks, billions of people around the globe radically adjusted their lifestyles and abided by the rules and regulations and instructions of health authorities. Scientists from around the globe, from literally every part of the globe, are working together, in the spirit of collaboration to find as quickly as possible a vaccine. So sure, I mean, we can find a lot of examples of, competition between countries, but that these things often shock us because we sort of expect something else. Yeah. Well, actually, if you look at the whole world history, if you would have talked to someone 100 years ago, sort of the standard was war and competition and nationalism and hatred between countries. That was completely normal. And now we expect something very different.
I mean, I've heard both Bill Gates and President Obama very movingly said at a speech I was at, he said, you want to know the best day to be born in the history of mankind? And it's today. Because actually, in terms of health, kindness, prospects, education, even though there's so much still to do, we've not done badly. I'm just thinking now, because we're now going to go to these other questions. I obviously will make a film about of your book. And the title track is going to be Reasons to be Cheerful. We'll give some money to Ian Dury's estate. So, Rutger, it's so great talking to you, and I hope that people do take away from it the idea of one sort of positive goodness in their own behavior, paying attention to more positive things, and now that they're all charging back into bookshops, obviously buying the book. So here we go. This is from Graham Allen. He says, hi, Rutger. I love the book. I'm helping the Citizens Convention on UK democracy to put a proposal to the UK government to use deliberative democracy to remake our creaking democracy. What's your own view of that process? It is something you actually talk about in the book.
Yes, I think it's a wonderful and fascinating movement. What we now have is a form of democracy that I think can best be described as an elective aristocracy. Yeah. So we're allowed to choose our own aristocrats every 3 or 4 years or something like that. I think we can move to a genuine democracy. And that was actually the original Greek idea of sortition, randomly selecting citizens from the population to be a politician every now and then.
Yeah.
I think in an ideal society, we would all become a politician at a point in our lives, or at least we would, all of us would know a couple of politicians, so that they're not those people far away in Westminster, but they're actually, you know, people from our community that we know. Now, again, you can only do this if you update your view of human nature. If you believe that people are just lazy and, you know, are disengaged and that they'll, you know, will not want to be involved with politics, then yes, then it's not going to happen. But what's really exciting is that, you know, there's been this whole movement since the 70s and 80s in indeed what's called deliberative democracy, where you bring people together from the left to the right, young, old, rich, poor, around the table, and you let them have sensible discussions about controversial subjects. Now, again, the problem here is that the press often doesn't really like it because it looks really boring. There was one show about it in the 90s, broadcast by Channel 4, called The People's Parliament. And what The Economist wrote at the time was that actually the discussions in the People's Parliament were better than in the real parliament. You know, the people from highly educated, no education at all, left-wing, right-wing, discussing really controversial subjects and coming up with sensible compromises. But yeah, it just, it's not the same as the daily entertainment that we usually call politics. But it is a very, very powerful idea.
I'm going to recommend that. And by the way, I think that, I mentioned the internet, but I didn't really ask you too much about it. But I don't think that politics has caught up in a good way with the internet. So in other words, what we're experiencing now is politics corrupting the internet and using the internet the wrong way. But I'm actually wondering whether or not the Zoom world that we're in, because I think one of the problems with sort of deliberative democracy would seem to me that you slightly think, I've got to, the weather's bad, I've got to go somewhere, I've got to be amongst people I don't know. And I do wonder whether, you know, as people are discovering and looking to issues online, and as you can get access straight to people, as we've been seeing even on Question Time in the UK, I do wonder whether the internet might actually revive the ability and increase the ability of us to get into the living rooms of those in power and discuss and create movements in a way that haven't been there. That's
but let's remember though that we have evolved as a species for face-to-face contact. We as human beings, we have got the most expressive faces in the animal kingdom. We already talked about our unique ability to blush. Our eyes are also very special. You know, we can follow each other's gazes because we've got white around our irises. All the other primates, they've got dark around their irises, which means they're a bit like poker players wearing shades. It's so much easier to trust one another if you're actually, you know, standing in front of each other. And hate becomes much more possible if this distance increases. And I think that's basically what happens on Twitter.
Yeah,
people do things that they could normally never do.
I'm going to move this light, which is, I suddenly feel I'm bright red.
Is it getting too dark here? I mean, you're the director. Should I put on the light?
Let's hope when we achieve genuine contact that you and I get on with each other as well. I have no idea what height you are. I'm always very uncomfortable with tall people. I always feel I have to like be silly. If anyone's over 6'5", I turn into a kind of performing seal.
Don't worry, I'm not too tall, but I don't know what I am in terms of feet. I know what I am in terms of meters. 184.
Okay, here's another one. Oh, this is sort of goes back to what I was saying, which, can you let us know how Jared Diamond and Steven Pinker, have responded to your questioning of their theses? This is a bit of gossip now. Have you heard back from any of the people? I know some of them are dead, but whose work you've questioned? Yeah,
well, Jared Diamond and Steven Pinker are still very much alive. I recently did a discussion for a podcast with Steven Pinker, and you know, we agreed to disagree, I guess. I admire, you know, parts of his work, but I think he's absolutely wrong when it comes to his description of, you know, the early history of warfare. He has this Hobbesian view, you know, Thomas Hobbes, the British philosopher, who argued that in, you know, our very early history, when we were still nomadic hunter-gatherers, we were engaged in this kind of war of all against all. And I think the evidence for that is, well, it's just not there, right? There are no cave paintings of that. There's no archaeological evidence. So, and if you look at nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes who lived in the 19th and 20th century, they don't really engage in these kind of wars. Yeah, I sort of disagree with them. But then, I mean, I think it's clear to anyone from who reads my book that obviously many of these writers have been role models for me as well.
Yeah.
Whether, you know, Steven Pinker or Jared Diamond or Harari, I disagree with them in many ways, but I've loved reading their books. And in many ways, they've been an inspiration for me because they just show that you can actually ask the bigger questions. And you don't always have, I mean, even though specialization is very important. I mean, I couldn't have written this book without all these brilliant specialists who've done like 4 years of a PhD for just which is one sentence in my book. But then it is actually possible to zoom out and to talk about the bigger picture. So I've been very much inspired in that way by their work.
By the way, if people charge out and buy your book, because we want to pour money back into the economy, are there a couple of other books you'd like to recommend? Clearly not Lord of the Flies.
Well, I mean, people can still read Lord of the Flies.
No, but are there, you know, in terms of things that have influenced you and books that you feel have made a practical difference, there are a couple of things that are your lodestars or whatever that word is?
Sure. So what was interesting to me was that many of these scientists that have debunked the more cynical view of human nature, they're actually women. So I think that part of the shift in looking at who we are as a species has to do something with, you know, the increased diversity. Someone like Marie Lindegaard, a psychologist who's looked at the bystander effect, you know, how we behave when there's a local emergency, someone's drowning, for example. Turns out in 90% of all cases, we help each other.
No, there's brilliant work on that. I've seen like videos where they put together all the things of CCTV and much human instinct is to help.
I've couldn't have written this book without the work of Gina Perry. She's an Australian psychologist who's written about the Milgram experiments. We haven't talked about that, you know, the shock machine experiment.
Oh yeah.
In which people were supposedly willing to give electric shocks to completely innocent other people. Well, it's a long story, but her books are great. And then I would really recommend the work of Rebecca Solnit. She's an American writer. She's written 2 books that I really love. One is called Hope in the Dark, which is, I think, very relevant right now, is sort of how to stay hopeful, not necessarily optimistic, but hopeful when times seem to be really, really bad. She wrote it, I think, in 2003 or 2004 when the Iraq war was starting, or it just started. Don't really remember, but when everything, you know, seemed to be really bad. And it's just this wonderful book about hope. And she also wrote A Paradise Built in Hell, which is how people respond to disasters. I also loved Helen Lewis' book, a recent new book about the history of feminism in Great Britain. It's called
these are all by women. Sorry, what's that called?
Difficult Women.
Oh yes,
that's what it's called. And she makes this point that progress so often comes from women who are willing to be nasty and difficult. I absolutely love that book. I think it should be read by anyone who wants to sort of change the world, because she writes about how it actually happens, not just about the theory or the idea, but how do you actually build a movement? What kind of uncomfortable compromises do you have to make? I love that book.
Okay, well, look, those are great recommendations. Talking about difficult people, you know, my greatest inspiration has been Bob Geldof, who's the most difficult man, you know, you could almost think of meeting, but it was that very difficulty which made him so potent. One of the things, by the way, that kept going through my mind when I was reading the book was a quotation. It's so weird, the things that sort of hang on in your mind. Quotation from E.M. Forster. I think it's from Howard's End. Mm-hmm. And it says, the confidence trick is the work of man, but the lack of confidence trick is the work of the devil. And I've always thought about that. If every time anyone asks you for money in the street, you think, yeah, they're probably a con artist, they probably don't need it, they're probably working with someone, then it denies you the opportunity of your soul to help the 90% of people who actually do need that money desperately to get home or to get for food. And I do that. It's funny, that's been at the center of my life all that time. And in some ways it could be the quote for your book, because if you trust that human beings will behave well, then they probably will. Whereas if you enter into anything saying human beings are always going to behave badly, when people criticize Red Nose Day, which is a charity thing I do here, I point out that Cynics Nose Day has not raised a penny. You know, they've not made any money at all. At least we've made some.
Exactly. I think that cynicism is another word for laziness.
Yeah.
Both intellectual laziness and practical laziness. So intellectually, it's a relatively easy explanation for all the evils in the world. Why do wars exist? Why do people behave in a nasty way? Well, just because they are nasty.
Yeah.
End of the book. Very easy. And practically, I mean, if you're cynical, then what's the point of activism? What's the point of actually doing something and trying to be a good person? You just have an excuse because, I mean, things will go wrong anyway. So I really think that cynicism is laziness.
Yeah, be more critical of cynics. Like I've always, you know, when you're in the comedy business, you do realize, like remembering from the playground, that no matter what you said, if someone ever said to you, "Oh, ha ha," you're dead in the water. There are no more jokes. Just that absolutely knockdown attitude and that joyless attitude will stop anyone ever being funny, and yet achieves. It just makes everyone feel bad. So I'm going to end with a question cleverer than any of the ones I've asked, Rutger, and then I think we're coming to an end in 3 minutes. It says here, this is from Jeff Nugent. Why would it not be better to accept and expect that humans have a great capacity for everything at both ends of the many possible continuums of thought, behavior, and feelings? Then we can focus on personally and collectively choosing those people who seem most likely to generate the quality of life and relationship we most desire to create, maintain, and recover. Wouldn't this balanced and situational approach be most likely to succeed individually, interpersonally, and for our society? So I think in a way, is he saying there, make good choices in who you spend time with and how you spend it? You understand the question better than me.
Yes. Well, I recognize that a too optimistic view of human nature or too romantic or utopian view of human nature could actually be a really, really dangerous thing, because that would make us too vulnerable to people who are corrupted by power or for our capacity to do the most horrible things in the name of loyalty and friendship. So when I talk about, you know, moving to a realistic view of human nature, I talk about, you know, recognizing the paradox that's within us. But it's also about, as I said, you know, discarding veneer theory and discarding the idea that deep down we're just selfish. And the second thing that I think is really important here is to recognize that ideas are never merely ideas. Stories are never merely stories. They tend to become true if we believe in them. They tend to become self-fulfilling prophecies. We have this in medicine where, you know, we've long known about the placebo effect. If you actually really believe that some kind of medicine is going to cure you, then, you know, it might just, you know, we have a huge amount of evidence that this works. We also know about the nocebo. If you think that something's going to make you sick, then it probably is going to. And ideas can be a little bit like that. So our view of human nature tends to create the kind of people that it presupposes. So even if I'm wrong, then I still think it would be good if people would actually believe me.
Yeah, so I think people should read the book. It's not simplistic. You know, it's optimistic and picks extremely good examples and debunks bad examples, and there's a lot of history and a lot of science in it. I think there are reasons to be optimistic in many ways. And I do think that, you know, I love you ending with a action guide. I wish most novels ended with an action guide.
Can I actually
don't marry anyone called Darcy.
Can I actually end with a quote from a thinker that I really like, that I used as to start the epilogue with, if you don't mind?
Oh no, well, I know what's going on here.
If you make a film about a man kidnapping a woman and chaining her to a radiator for 5 years, something that has happened probably once in history, it's called searingly realistic analysis of society. If I make a film like Love Actually, which is about people falling in love, and there are about 1 million people falling in love in Britain today, it's called a sentimental presentation of an unrealistic world. You know, I think that's a pretty good summary of this whole thing.
Well, that's very sweet of you. I mean, I wish, having watched Normal People, I wish my films had been more realistic. But I do think that there is a tendency somehow to, you know, deny our own experience of quite how well things can work when people do work together. And I hope that people, you know, read the book and come away from today with some you know, some sense of optimism, but not only unrealistic optimism, but realistic optimism, that there's good reason to believe. And we've seen so much of it in the COVID crisis, and we're seeing signs of good and bad in the Black Lives Matter, that the world's going to get better for our kids. And let's pray it does.
Can't agree more. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you very much indeed. What a lovely night.